This is Dan Gwynn with FrancisSchaefferStudies.org, and it's my privilege to introduce you to the next installment of the Francis Schaeffer Legacy Project. Recently, we attended the annual conference of the International Society of Christian Apologetics and caught up with Dr. Donald Williams to get his thoughts on Schaeffer. And before we begin, let me remind you of the reason behind these interviews. It's not to set Dr. Schaeffer up on some kind of pedestal, but rather to preserve the history and memory of Dr. Schaeffer from those who knew him, met him, or were heavily influenced by him. They are to capture a glimpse of what sort of man he truly was from the words of others and hear how they were inspired to further the kingdom of Christ because of his ministry. As Dr. Bruce A. Little says, Schaeffer is not an icon to be venerated, but a Christian scholar evangelist of exceptional cloth, from whom we can learn much in our passion to reach the nations for Christ. And with that, we'll join Jason Chaitel as he interviews Dr. Donald Williams.
We have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Williams here this afternoon. Thank you for your time. To introduce him to our viewers, Dr. Williams holds a BA in English and an MDiv and a PhD in medieval and Renaissance literature. He is the author of 8 books, including most recently Mere Humanity, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien on the Human Condition. I do have the book and I recommend it. The Devil's Dictionary of the Christian Faith, Stars Through the Clouds, collected poetry of Donald T. Williams, Reflections from Plato's Cave, Essays in Evangelical Philosophy, which is his latest book. He's also contributed essays, poems, and reviews in such journals as National Review, Christianity Today, Touchstone Magazine, Modern Reformation, the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, Philosophia Christi, Theology Today, Christianity and Literature, Christian Scholars Review, Myth Lore, and 7, an Anglo-American Review, etc. He's an ordained minister in the Evangelical Free Church of America with many years of pastoral experience, and he's spent several summers in Africa training local pastors for Church Planting International. And he currently serves as the R4 Scholar and Professor of English at Toccoa Falls College in the hills of Northeast Georgia. Also, he's the newest board member of the International Society of Christian Apologetics. And congratulations on that, sir.
Well, I will find out if congratulations are in order as time goes on, I suppose.
How did you meet Francis Schaeffer?
Well, it was 1968, maybe 69, and I had just discovered C.S. Lewis, who taught me that a Christian mind was a real possibility, and that it was possible for me to stay a Christian without getting rid of my intellectual integrity. And Schaeffer came along. His books were just coming out. I think the first one I read was Escape from Reason, then The God Who Was There. And what Schaeffer gave me, Lewis gave me a rich, deep Christian mind. Schaeffer gave me an integrative mind. That is, he showed me that it was possible to use the biblical worldview in such a way that you would take all the different aspects of life and show how they related together and made sense. So we could understand history and culture and art and everything from a biblical worldview. That was a possibility that never even entered into my adolescent fundamentalist mind before I ran into Schaeffer. And so, along with Lewis and Tolkien, Schaeffer became really one of the people who was feeding my mind and getting it organized in those days. So I was grabbing each one of his books the minute it came out and devouring it. I had the privilege of meeting Schaeffer in person on a couple of different occasions. Labrie conferences that were held at Covenant College in Tennessee in 1971 and 73. I was an undergraduate in college at that time, and I skipped a week of classes to go sit at Schaeffer's feet, and skipping those classes was the best academic decision I ever made.
What was your most memorable moment with Schaeffer? You say that you came in contact with him a few times, so which was the most memorable?
Well, I would probably have to go with 1973. Schaeffer and I both got to that conference early when hardly anybody else was there. And so the thing that astonished me was we had met 2 years earlier and not spent a lot of one-on-one time together, but I was in small group discussions and asked questions, and we had met. And between those two times, Schaeffer probably talked to 1,000 people easily. So there was no way he was going to remember me. But as soon as he saw me across the lobby, we were both coming into the building there, he immediately came across, remembered me from 2 years before, and it was like, I'm so glad you've come. And here I am in the presence of this great man, one of the great Christian leaders of the 20th century. And he's actually trying to convince me that he's the one who's honored by my presence, a guy who's still just a senior in college. So that moment sort of crystallizes, I think, a lot about Schaeffer's character. Although he was an intellectual, he wasn't an ivory tower intellectual, and he cared about people, he interacted with people, and he really made those people feel important because they actually were important to him. And I'd learned a lot about thinking as a Christian from Schaeffer up to that moment. At that moment, I got a vision of how far I still had to travel before I could reach the kind of true spirituality that he not only wrote about but manifested. I was full of my own thoughts. I did not care about other people or connect with other people the way Schaeffer did. And so as a result, until I learned some more of that, any of the thoughts he was helping me have weren't really going to do a whole lot of good in the world. So I'll never forget that moment.
How has that helped you as a teacher? You've been a professor for 25 years. How has that helped you in applying that with students in your classroom?
Well, I think it basically started a long process of God trying to beat some humility into me. The fact that I recognized what was happening, realized I'm not like that. But if God's going to use me, I need to be. That doesn't make it happen just because you have that realization. So I think it was the start of a long process that, and there were other people that set me good examples too, that I hope has gotten me to the place where I can actually be some use in the kingdom with the thinking that the Lord's allowed me to do.
What impact did the teaching of Schaeffer have on your work, your professional work?
Well, I've been an integrationist in the sense of doing interdisciplinary work. That's been my inclination. I think that's where some of my best insights have come from, is out of the cross-pollination of different fields. And Schaeffer showed how that could be done and done profitably. he gave us a model of methodology of how the biblical worldview actually touches every part of life, gave us the vision, and of course I've been pursuing that ever since. So I'm, in theory, I'm supposed to be the medieval and Renaissance guy in the English department at Toccoa Falls, but I teach our apologetics course. I teach some theology. I teach intro to philosophy. And so what I got from Schaeffer really was initially just the idea that, you know what, history and theology and philosophy and music and art and literature and popular culture really all are related to each other. So I kind of frustrate my students sometimes because they come and insofar as they're serious students, you know, they're taking notes, I mean, they're putting these notes in manila folders, and they're all stacked in their mental filing cabinet, and they're trying to make it neat and organized so they can understand it. But what I want to do with them is I take all those folders, dump them out into a big messy pile in the middle of the floor where music and art and history and science and literature and theology and philosophy are all jumbled together, which is the way they are in real life. And say, okay, now start finding some connections here. And it drives them crazy, but I think it does them some good.
How should we then live would be a good example of that then.
I don't think that's Schaeffer's strongest work. It's he's I think by the time he wrote that book and made that film series, he was aware that he was aiming over the heads of a lot of Christian young people, and he's trying a little bit too hard to pull it down and make it popular. And so there are weaknesses in that presentation that you don't find in a book like The God Who Is There, where Schaeffer is at his best. Mm-hmm. There's good material in that series, but also statements that are going to cause historians who are experts in particular fields to just tear their hair out. Mm-hmm. But I would say The God Who Is There and Escape from Reason are the place to start with Schaeffer. If you really understand those books, you have a platform from which you can look out across the world and really understand what's happening. Schaeffer got the reputation of being a prophet. It wasn't because he was a prophet in the biblical sense. He denied being one. But he understood the principles by which the way people think interact with what they do and how they approach the different areas of life. And by understanding those principles, he was able to say things that sound astoundingly prophetic, mm-hmm. now that we look back on the history that's taken place since then. So I would say absorb first The God Who Is There, then Escape from Reason, and that will give you the best window into not only the rest of Schaeffer's works, because he actually based everything else on what he had done in those two books, but into life.
What would you say to those who are considering reading Schaeffer for the first time?
Do it.
Just get on it, right? And you would recommend
I really
already the trilogy,
right?
First.
I really already answered that question. Yeah. God Who Is There, Escape from Reason, and True Spirituality are the most important books that Schaeffer wrote. Not that others aren't very important, but in his own mind, everything was based on those three. I think he was naive to think people were actually going to read his books in that order. But a book like The Christian Manifesto or Great Evangelical Disaster read very differently if you see them as applications of the principles in The God Who Is There and True Spirituality to what was happening at that point in Schaeffer's life and in our history. They read very differently if you're coming from the God who was there than they do if you just pick them out of the blue. And unfortunately, people don't do that. But start with the God who was there, true spirituality, maybe the escape from reason. Then, when you've got that as a foundation, you can go to any of Schaeffer's other works, and you'll understand them, I think, in the way that he was intending.
How would you say that Schaeffer is still relevant today, and in the theological crises, the physical or the philosophical climate that we're in? How is he still relevant in 2012?
Well, one of Shakespeare's awkward phrases, but a necessary one, was true truth. Schaeffer understood that when he was writing back in the 60s, in the 70s, that Western culture had already lost its grip on the idea of truth as being something that's objectively so, whether anybody likes it or not. And he was seeing that the church, at first, Schaeffer was saying, look, we're offering people truth, but they don't even have a concept of truth. So you have to start with that. You have to make sure that they're on the same page with you about truth. Truth comes before conversion was one of the phrases he often liked to use. He was absolutely right. What's happened since then is that now the church has become accommodated to that worldview that denies the existence of truth. Even people who call themselves evangelical Christians are really operating with a concept of truth where truth is subjective. It's merely a matter of personal perspectives, not something that is objectively true. And that destroys the whole Christian faith. It doesn't seem to at first, but it does, because if Christ is only Lord of my perspectives, he's not Lord of the universe, and therefore he's in no position to save me or anybody else. So Schaeffer saw that coming and was addressing it in terms appropriate to his day. The sad thing is we haven't learned those lessons, and so we've actually gone backward. But Schaeffer's message about the importance of truth and about truth logically actually coming before conversion. Pre-evangelism. That message is more important now and more crucial now to any success we might have in being faithful witnesses for Christ than it was when he was writing.
I know that you have a lot of experience and research in CS Lewis, and you are familiar very much so with Schaeffer. Do you know if Schaeffer was reading Lewis's books? Did he appreciate them, or do you see evidences of influence?
They never met. Lewis did not know about Schaeffer because Lewis died in 1963, whereas Schaeffer didn't really become a public figure until the late 60s. Mm-hmm. Schaeffer had clearly read Lewis and appreciated him, and he quotes from him more than one occasion. So there was some good influence flowing in one direction.
Just for fun, because Dan can always edit this out with the Video Magic software.
He'll edit that out, I'm pretty sure.
But
or maybe not, just to give that sense of reality to what we're doing.
The reality is we're all brothers here. So, but I thought I'd throw out a couple names, and you tell me what you think about these names in relation to Schaeffer and today, and just whatever your thoughts are. The first name I'll throw out there is a common one, Thomas Aquinas.
Well, Schaeffer gets a lot of grief over his interpretation of Aquinas, and I think that Aquinas was not, as Schaeffer implies, the major reason for our move away from a biblical view of truth and reality. It's not Aquinas's fault personally that the divorce between faith and reason has come about. If you read Thomas Aquinas, I mean, he wrote tons of stuff. If you read Aquinas, you'll find that Schaeffer's Aquinas is actually in Aquinas. You'll also find that the Aquinas of Schaeffer's critics is also in Aquinas. So Schaeffer wasn't so much wrong about Aquinas, as he's often accused of being, but he does give us an oversimplified picture of Aquinas and of Aquinas' influence in history. The great thing about Schaeffer was he teaches us how to see the forest for the trees. Well, any expert on one of those trees is never going to be satisfied with Schaeffer's treatment of his tree. In fact, we've become so over-specialized in academia today. People aren't even experts on one tree. They spend their whole life studying one leaf on one tree. As a result of that over-specialization, we end up not being able to see the forest for the trees. Schaeffer was about letting us see the layout of the forest. And he's right in his general topography that he gives us for understanding how the different trees relate together in the woods. So is he sometimes oversimplified? Yes, but simplified doesn't necessarily mean wrong. And Schaeffer, in those statements he's making about some of these thinkers like Aquinas, has a valid point that shouldn't be lost in the midst of people who say, well, yeah, there's more to Aquinas than that. And that's not really exactly what Aquinas was doing. Those guys are right. Schaeffer was also right in seeing that there has been a shift in our way of thinking, in our understanding of how faith and reason relate. And so let's not lose the forest and the trees, and let's not lose the important things Schaeffer had to teach us in the picayune criticism about some of the details.
So the next name I wanted to throw out there was Karl Bart. Is Karl Bart still influential today? And what about Schaeffer and his critique of Karl Bart?
We're in the midst of a Bart revival. He's more influential today than he probably was at any time since Schaeffer was writing. And Bart is one of those guys that there's a lot of good stuff you can learn from him, but I think there are some significant problems. Theologically, Bart is all about grace. He's all about God's initiative in salvation, salvation by grace, not by what we do. He's all about being Christocentric. And those things are all very positive. I think where Bart can lead you astray, though, is in epistemology. And Schaeffer might have been a little harder on Bart than he deserved, if you look at the big picture. But I think Schaeffer's right. Bart's epistemology is the epistemology of modern liberal skepticism. And he tries to salvage biblical faith out of that without fully giving it up. I think he's trying to have his cake and eat it too, and I don't think you can. So Schaeffer's criticism of Bart at the point of Bart's being infected by the dialectical methodology as opposed to the biblical view of antithesis, I think Schaeffer was right, basically.
Comment a little, if you would, on Edith.
Edith Schaefer.
Yes.
Schaeffer looked to her as his right arm, and and they were definitely a team. She didn't have his intellect. I find her books a little bit frustrating because her idea of good writing was to use all the adjectives she could think of. And so it's like it's almost like eating pecan pie. You know, you can only take so much of it at a time. But she was absolutely essential, I think, to the success of that ministry because L'Abri wasn't just about ideas. It was about ideas encountered in a community. And it was Edith who provided the hospitality that made that community work. So what made L'Abri effective was a total combination. Schaeffer's teaching, Schaeffer's ideas being heard, being wrestled with in the context of a community where they're actually being worked out. And Edith was absolutely essential to that.
I'm out of questions, unless you want to take on Soren Kierkegaard.
I'll get in so much trouble for saying this, but I think Schaeffer was just right about Kierkegaard.
Really?
Yeah. Kierkegaard, I mean, to be fair to him, Kierkegaard is wrestling against the dead orthodoxy that surrounded him and rightly rejecting it. But he does it in ways that ultimately are irrationalist and which do not give us, I think, positive methodological models that will enable us to escape the thing he was trying to escape.
So you think that it was fair assessment then he did open the door and provide the foundation, even if he himself didn't walk through it, for Bart, the existentialists?
I think it was a
secular
factor, yeah.
existentialists. Okay. Excellent.
Now, how much he's a symptom of what's happening in Christianity in the modern world and how much a cause, that's a complicated question. I don't necessarily know the answer, but he's not unconnected to the path that has taken us to the irrationalist forms of faith that we're wrestling with today.
Tell me about postmodernism. Some people have said it's on the wane. It's had its day. It's dying, or is it?
Well, it is. It has passed its peak of influence, but what's going to replace it has not yet become clear.
Mysticism?
Well, you can be a postmodern mystic, so I don't know that that's really a replacement. But yes, I think it's true that its influence has peaked, but it's still a huge player on the scene, and nothing else has come along to replace its influence. And so, yeah, we still have to deal with it. And it still largely defines the world of discourse that we are inhabiting. Schaeffer didn't deal with postmodernism directly because he was a little bit too early. It only became a self-conscious movement in the 70s, by which time Schaeffer's career was winding down. But he anticipates it. He sees it coming. He talks about it before it was there to be talked about. And he's absolutely right. Postmodernism simply translates the irrationality that Schaeffer was fighting against into a different set of jargon. And so the postmodernist is all about skepticism about meta-narratives. There are no valid meta-narratives. Well, if there are no valid meta-narratives, then Christianity can't be true, because Christianity is a meta-narrative. It's a big story, a story with a capital S, that explains how to understand everything. And if it's not that, why should we be interested? if it's not truth that comes from the creator of the world and therefore touches all of life, as Schaeffer said, if it's just our perspectives on things, then we have nothing to offer the world and nothing to cling to ourselves. So, yeah, postmodernism, thank God, has passed its peak, but that doesn't mean we can ignore it. Doesn't mean we don't still have to wrestle with it, because it's very much still around us.
One more question for you. Tell us what your upcoming plans are. You just finished Plato's Cave. What's next in store?
This summer I'm going to be trying to finish a manuscript on the theology of C.S. Lewis. He's the most influential Christian writer of the 20th century, but we have no work critiquing his theology as a whole. There are books that summarize it but don't really analyze and critique it. What I'm going to try to do is go through systematically the theology that lies behind the Narnia books, the Space Trilogy, and the popular apologetics, and ask, how biblical is it? And the answer will be usually and mostly and largely very biblical, but at certain points we need to be aware that Lewis was exploring areas that are doctrinally and biblically problematic. So we need to be able to use discernment, and hopefully this book will help us appreciate Lewis's great contribution more fully and more accurately and with more discernment than we have been able up to this time.
I know. We're looking forward to that. Well, thank you, sir, for your time.
My pleasure.